Well, we're delighted to welcome our Oklahoma Farm Bureau members back today for the final edition of, actually next to final edition because we're going to have a wrap-up on Friday, but our final day of GIST for Farm Bureau Leadership Week, and where we've been thinking all about state issues with Governor Stitt on Monday and the Speaker and Pro Tem on Tuesday. Well, actually the mayors, I guess, were after the Speaker and Pro Tem and talking about urban-rural issues, and then we had our wrapping up today with a view at the federal terrain, which has changed dramatically since our last visit, Mr. Congressman. And we're delighted to have one of our own Farm Bureau members and a real ag leader, a real hands-on farmer. That's what we all think. Linda may have a different opinion about how hands-on he is, but we're delighted to welcome Congressman Frank Lucas, who, of course, is a dear friend of Oklahoma Farm Bureau members and has been involved since his days in the State House with us. So Congressman, I'd maybe open it up a little bit. Always one of the first questions we ask congressmen and senators is what committee assignments have you got for this session, and give us a lay of what this session looks like as you're getting started.
Absolutely, Mr. President. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for noting quite correctly who runs the cattle operation at home, Linda Lucas, and works very diligently to tolerate me on weekends when I come home, as I come home every weekend, to make sure I'm pointed in the right direction. We're organized up. The 117th session of Congress is underway. From a perspective of the body, how could it be any closer, be more complicated? The other side of the building, the United States Senate, 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. The majority leader of the Senate is determined when Vice President Harris comes and breaks the tie every morning. So 50-50 plus one, couldn't be any more complicated than that. On the House side, we're within a half a dozen votes. The Republicans are being the majority. We actually gained seats in this complicated election. So that's the general lay of the land. From my own personal perspectives, I'll be once again ranking member, the senior Republican on the Science Committee. If we were in control, I would be chairman of the full committee. That's the committee with jurisdiction over the National Weather Service, a jurisdiction over NASA and all the space programs, a jurisdiction over the National Science Foundation, all the research dollars that fund a variety of things, a lot of amazing things out there across the country. And also we have a jurisdiction over the portion of the Department of Energy's programs that relate to energy research. In addition to that, I will be actually the most senior Republican, although not the ranking member, on the Financial Services Committee, and I'll serve on the subcommittees over there with jurisdiction over financial institutions. We look over the bank, over the shoulders of the banks, the credit unions, and all of those kind of entities. And I also will be doing duty once again on the Diversity Subcommittee of Financial Services. That's an interesting concept, and at some point we should probably talk long and hard about that, as well as, of course, in my role as former chairman of the Agriculture Committee, watching the process going on that committee as they spend the next 2 years getting geared up for the 2023 Farm Bill. While I'm not a member of the Ag Committee in this session of Congress because of the number of freshmen and the limited number of slots, nonetheless, I have my letter and I'm a member in waiting. I'll be back for the 2023 Farm Bill, which will not be done in this 2-year session, but in the next 2-year session. So with that, Rod, it's a complicated place. The bodies, both House and Senate, are evenly divided. We've come through as much turmoil as I've seen in my career. And once again, I'm on the committees that I think make a difference to the folks back home in Oklahoma.
Being on if in the next election, the numbers are so close, and a lot of people think that the House might flip back to Republicans next time. If that were to happen, then you would be chairman of the Science and Space
I would be chairman
Committee.
of the Science and Space Committee, and with an increased ratio, I would expect then to also be a member of Financial Services and back on the Agriculture Committee. And having reserved my seniority, that was part of the agreement I had with leadership and steering. When I would return to Ag, I'll sit next to whoever the chairman is in that next session of Congress at the top of the dais.
That's a pretty important role, and we're sure delighted to have you in those important roles, and the comfort of knowing you'll be back at Ag when the next Farm Bill comes up. So So that's good news, Mr. Congressman. Now, other changes in Washington, of course, one of the agency that affects agriculture the most is the USDA. And with a change in presidential administrations from Trump to Biden, we have a new Secretary of Ag, and now there'll be a whole flurry of other new faces at USDA. Give us, I know you're very close to that agency and, of course, worked with the new secretary before. Maybe give us an update about what you see out of the new administration and particularly the new USDA lineup.
That's the old line, Mr. President. What is old is new again. Well, our new Secretary of Agriculture served for 8 years as the Secretary of Ag under the Obama administration. I won't deny for a moment that I'll miss Secretary Perdue, our Secretary of Ag for the last 4 years. I thought he had a wonderful understanding of agriculture in general. But with Secretary Vilsack, I start off very optimistic. Secretary and I had a little bit of a rough getting to know each other period a dozen years ago when I was first ranking member and then chairman of the Agriculture Committee when we did the 2014 Farm Bill when Tom was secretary. But we developed a really good working relationship. And my concerns had always been when you come from a state that's basically a corn and bean farm with a few towns in it, what's your understanding of the great diversity of production agriculture all across this country, farming and ranching, all of those things? And Tom demonstrated himself to be very helpful. He was key in making the 2014 Farm Bill happen, and I much appreciate that. So I'm pleased to see Secretary Vilsack back in that role again. Now, it's a different administration. It's a different world, and he has some different challenges to face this time. On the positive side, of course, the 2014 Farm Bill was the framework for the 2018 Farm Bill. The 2018 Farm Bill, I believe, will be the framework for the 2023 Farm Bills, the third generation Farm Bills, as I like to describe them. But Secretary, he has some particular challenges that he's going to have to deal with. And bear in mind, in the world he's come into in this administration, there's a huge focus in the Biden administration on what they refer to as racial justice, rooting out discrimination in USDA and in the USDA programs. There's a big focus in the administration on climate change, whether you want to use the old phrase global warming or not, climate change. And I believe Secretary Vilsack's past record is such that he'll understand the importance of voluntary and incentive-based solutions. You know, use the carrot to encourage good things. Don't use a stick to try and beat people economically into submission. I think they'll be focused on a USDA that's carbon neutral, so to speak. And there's indications that the administration's talking about using Commodity Credit Corporation funds to try and develop some kind of a carbon bank to move us in that direction. Along the same lines, there's still issues in the meat packing and the cattle industry that have to be addressed. I'm still waiting on that final report from the Department of Justice to lay out if there are any antitrust violations, if Stocker and Packers Acts have been violated. The Secretary indicated in his hearings and public statements that he's very supportive of the Ramp Up Act, a big program that I'm working on with my colleagues to try and increase the access to packing opportunities to make sure there are more packers out there, and not just the huge packers, but a diversity by which we can sell our livestock to. Secretary, of course, is going to be focused on biofuels. He's from Iowa, corn and beans, after all, and trying to take the ethanol number up to 15%. Shouldn't surprise anybody. That would create a dramatic new demand for all of that sort of thing. So he's out there in that mix, advocating for that. From my own personal perspective on the racial justice issue, of course, everyone needs to be treated equally. Everyone needs to be treated fairly. Everyone should have the opportunity to live up to their potential. So as long as we try to achieve those things, we'll all be supportive of that. The climate change issues, as long as it's an incentive-based voluntary set of programs, as long as we are treated equitably in agriculture in rural America, which means ultimately consumers are treated equitably in our policies as they match up with the rest of the world, then we'll all take a look at that too. Again, I'm not the stick guy, I'm the carrot guy. And on packers and the livestock industry, let's do the Ramp Up Act. Let's get that Justice Department report. Let's move on from there. What else? Let
me dig into three of those things in a little bit more detail real quickly. We just had meeting with the very sharp young lady who's going to be undersecretary at Agriculture. Spent over an hour with 50 state presidents, and most of the hour, she's formerly with the Aspen Institute, and I'll have to admit she's quite bright and was very impressive. But everything came back to racial diversity and to the carbon question. Every issue that came up. So that kind of reinforces what you were just saying there. She was saying that ag has had a problem of being too white and too male, and there's going to be a real determination that all the FSA directors and rural development directors and everything else looks like America, which is what the president's been saying. And then even more attention to the carbon issue. But you're pretty convinced that any issues along the carbon, do you think they'll be suggesting voluntary programs, or you think you'll have to be pushing from Congress to make sure that they're voluntary programs?
If you look at what the speakers group advocates, her leadership here in the majority, then it's going to be more of a stick than a carrot. And we're all in the early stages of that. From my perspective, we're still the best stewards of the soil, the water, and the air, those of us who live in rural America, those of us who are involved in production ag. Helping us do the right thing, the incentive-based programs, then we'll make some things happen. But if you sign us up to international agreements where we disproportionately pay a price in the United States, if we don't have the same standards worldwide, I don't see how they can make that happen. That 50-50 United States Senate that I mentioned earlier, where the vice president breaks the tie every day and makes Chuck Schumer of New York the majority leader. Here in the House, where Nancy typically will only have a 4 or 5 seat margin with which to move her bills through. If they can't achieve consensus, Mr. President, in the regular legislative order, they're not going to pass anything. Now, what are they talking about doing? Well, there's a mechanism that it's available in each budget cycle, which wasn't used in the last one, which is available then, now, and potentially next year. So 3 of what they refer to as budget reconciliation bills or resolutions. That only requires a 50+1 vote in the Senate and a simple majority in the House. It's possible they could do a variety of things using budget reconciliation, but budget reconciliation is intended to reduce spending or to increase spending. It's not supposed to reach out into all of these policy areas. Some would argue that they can create rules in the Senate that would allow that to pass. But if that's the case, Rod, if they choose not to work with the whole body, then they're only going to have 3 bills. It'll be these 3 big budget reconciliation packages. They'll have to fund the government. They'll have to do all their agendas. They'll pass by simple majority, but it'll be in the most partisan slam and jam fashion you've ever seen. That's not how you create good policy. We got Obamacare. We got Dodd-Frank the last time Speaker Pelosi was Speaker by using that mechanism, and both were flawed laws. I am an eternal optimist. You know, I always say I'm a wheat farmer. Put the seed in the ground, I expect to harvest a crop. I'm an eternal optimist legislatively. They have to go to some semblance of regular order if they're going to do good legislative work. But if they want to slam and jam, we'll see what happens.
Along those lines of the slam and jam, the next coronavirus relief bill that the Biden administration proposed, I think, is $1.9 trillion, and it not only has a bunch of relief, but it has a whole bunch of agenda items. And the one I'm hearing the most from our members about is the increase in minimum wage to $15 and a bunch of changes on that kind of thing. That's what you're talking about stuffing stuff into another bill, I think. What are the prospects on that $15 minimum wage? And I know the Senate Republicans, a group of them have proposed a $600 billion plan. Where do you see this coronavirus deal going, and all these tag-on items are trying to stick into it?
I think President Biden needs the $1.9 trillion. The way they're going to handle the rest of the economy, they need so much money out there once again to just flood the economy. The real answer to addressing COVID-19 is to accelerate vaccine production. And I said on this issue from my hat on Science Committee, accelerate vaccine production of the existing vaccine lines. And then, as Moderna and a number of other companies are doing, prepare the booster shot for whatever mutations are occurring in South Africa and around the world for the next round. This is going to be like the flu. We're going to be vaccinated every so often for the rest of our lives. It's just where we are. That's how you get the economy back to going, is you get people to the point where they can, in a healthy fashion, conduct business, conduct their lives, and move around. Short of that, then they need as much money as they possibly can. The $15 minimum wage has been discussed as a part of that. Don't forget that the Biden administration is also talking about using the $30 billion in the CCC program, with potentially out authorizing legislation for a variety of these other issues. I know the Trump people showed great flexibility in using CC money in dealing with the trade issues with the Chinese. We'll see where that goes. My main point to my Democrat friends is, if you're going to use the CCC money, that is the cash account that we fund farm programs and conservation, a huge number of things out of. If you're going to use that 30 billion, then you've got to be prepared to put it right back in. You can't just take our money and not replace it, because it's just too critical to so many programs out there. So there's lots of challenges that lie ahead of us, Rod. I mean, just a lot of challenges.
Another thing you raised earlier was the beef market. And of course, with that being Oklahoma's biggest commodity, our biggest cash value, we all saw the shakeups that occurred in the disruptions of COVID and about getting beef through the narrow number of processing plants and so forth. And Oklahoma has led the way in trying to use part of the CARES money, the Governor Stitt and Blaine Arthur, to help stimulate a bunch of these new small meat packing operations. I know Senator Deb Fischer has been putting a lot of pressure on American Farm Bureau and other groups to support a bill on market flexibility that we have some concerns about. Tell us where you see the issues going. We seem to have Iowa and Nebraska and a bunch of those northern states that they do a lot of their marketing of cattle differently, from what I can pick up, than we do, but trying to look at the national issues through their lens. How do we address this and be equitable to those of us in Oklahoma and Texas and other parts of the country as well?
Bottom line, Rod, is expanding the demand for our product. And that's where Ramp Up and why Secretary Arthur and Governor Stitt's actions in Oklahoma were so important. But in Ramp Up and the other bills that I'm working on with my colleagues, doing things like making federally inspection service more available, more cost effective for the smaller plants is critical. I mean, you need that USDA stamp. The Oklahoma stamp is just as good as the USDA stamp on meat, absolutely just as good. It's just easier to sell it across state lines or into international markets if you have the USDA stamp. So things like that ultimately make the real difference in the long run, creating more competition, so that if you have a fire, as was the case at Holcomb, you don't destroy the value of livestock for months. Or you have a COVID outbreak that hits particularly large packing plants, as we saw in 2020, and it destroys the market for live product literally for months and drives up cash price on the other side for consumers in both cases through the ceiling. That's the ultimate answer. Now, I know a number of my colleagues want to take whatever the system is that pre-exists in their state and apply it to the whole country. Well, that's great if you want to make sure your people don't have to do anything different, if your people don't have to make any changes and just enforce it on everyone else. That's the way the Californians have tried to address a variety of livestock issues from poultry on up. That's not how you look at things. You have to look at the national effect, the national impact, and I would hope that's what we'll be doing. But again, it goes back to that Department of Justice, antitrust, packers and stockers investigation, which has not come out yet. And I'm waiting for those results, because if there's a definitive proof that things are going on that my constituents believe are going on, or suspicious are going on, maybe is a better word, then that's when the Department of Justice and Congress have to respond like a ton of bricks. But we're not quite to that point yet.
Is that the same? Is it a group of that same study that led to the charges in the chicken processing industry, or was that a completely separate study?
It was a different study, but it was the Department of Justice that went after and indicted people, and convictions have come out of that. Yes. So the law has demonstrated it works on the poultry side.
Okay, trade, of course, is huge, and you've mentioned about expanding our markets, and that doesn't matter which commodity. In Oklahoma, of course, trade in wheat and beef and pork are all huge international items that affect the gross state product of our state. and it's been a whipsaw for some years now for the ag community. Suddenly, at the moment, China's buying the most they've bought in forever. They've gone on a crazy buying spree right now from after the Trump agreement. Tell us where you think trade is headed and how the Biden administration is going to approach the trade, whether it's with Asia or Europe or wherever.
Well, so far, in the limited actions they've taken, they basically reinforced what President Trump had done on a number of tariffs and those kind of issues. I just hope that the Biden administration will stay focused. One of the great things that Donald Trump did, and everyone has an opinion one way or the other about our past president, was he put his thumb correctly on the issue that whether it was agricultural products or manufacturing or scientific technology or intellectual integrity, the Chinese had not been playing by the rules and had been manipulating, ask any cotton farmer, had been manipulating supply and demand in products they cared about for decades. And the president called them to task. And it was painful. And it was very painful to producers back home, which is why it was so important that throughout 19 and 20, the president supported funds to help producers get through this period as we got their attention. And we now have the Chinese attention. I'd hope we don't back off on that. We'll see. We'll see. But right now, on a variety of other issues, the Biden administration seems at this stage to be more focused than on what we would define as bread and butter issues, so to speak, economically. And that's where Vilsack comes in. He understands these issues, Secretary Vilsack does. And while he has to do the things he has to do to make the administration fulfill their commitments, and nonetheless, USDA is still about making sure that we have the ability to raise the food and fiber we need in this country and the ability to sell our surpluses into world markets. As you alluded to, we don't have a price if we don't have world demand, and we have to be into the world market. So I start off optimistic based on what cash prices have done in the last, since the first of the year. We'll just have to see if this trend holds.
The last couple of years, a disproportionate amount of farm income has been government payments, whether it's the trade imbalance payments or whether it's the PPP funds for to help folks with their employment, maintaining employment, and the regular FSA and conservation programs. And this last year hit a modern record, I think, of somewhere around 40%. Of course, that varies depending on the commodity, but that I think we all agree that can't continue. Do you think the market changes that we're seeing in cash prices are going to be long-term enough to offset that, or how do you look at the long-term picture at the moment?
That is my hope, Rod. If you remember back in the 2012 that became the 2013 that became the 2014 Farm Bill, there was a great debate about which way we went. Should government help only be there when there was a challenge, which was the angle I took, or should it be a steady flow as was advocated by some of the commodity groups in the Midwest? Right now, I think we've demonstrated that because of weather and because of prices and things beyond any farmer or rancher's control, that the help in times like we've been through for the last few years was critically important. Now, if the foreign markets hold and if we continue to export aggressively, cash prices stay up, then I'd like to think that we will step away from Uncle Sam being as helpful. Now, one other issue that we have to look at, and that's the weather. We had a really dry year in my part of the 3rd District. We didn't raise as much forage in the pastures. We've had no wheat pasture. There's still going to be a need for that safety net dealing with weather issues, even if cash prices are up. Because after all, as I try to explain to my colleagues here, sometimes, as in the early part of the last decade, it didn't matter that calves were worth $1,300 a piece. It didn't matter that wheat was record highs. If you don't have anything to sell, it doesn't help. So we still have to have that safety net there. But I'm optimistic that the markets are going to cooperate with us. I'm just always pessimistic because I'm from Oklahoma, and you and I both know the weather is an amazingly fickle friend in our great state.
Well, since you're over the National Weather Service in your committee now, I figured you'd figure out a way to solve those weather issues and bring consistency to our weather.
I may not be able to do that, but I'm working hard to make sure that we have modern state-of-the-art satellites that we're using the supercomputers to make those forecasts more effective, and that we are able to predict longer and longer in advance what Mother Nature is going to do to us so we can make strategic decisions at home. You and I, Rod, are old enough to remember when the weather guys and ladies were giving you a 24-hour guess when we were kids. Now they're doing a really amazing job 10 days out and are doing surprisingly well on long-term forecast. We just need to push that even farther and farther, because it's not only important to production ag. Think about the difference it makes to the oil and gas industry. How much natural gas needs to be out of the ground to be ready on a cold night? What kind of insurance rates should be calculated based on the weather? I mean, just a whole bunch of things out there that tee off a better weather forecasting. And we're headed in that direction through the use of ever-growing technology. And by the way, as an Oklahoman, I'd be remiss if I didn't note our state-run Mesonet system is an awesome example that Oklahoma's led on for 25, almost 30 years in weather research information availability to everyone, not by subscription, to everyone.
I know it was literally the first in the nation like that. It's still viewed as the best in the nation, isn't it?
And anytime we can make the Texans envious, I'm perfectly happy.
Well, I know you've got a committee reorganization you've got to get to in a minute, so I want to give you a chance. Is there any issue we haven't brought up that you want to bring up with our Farm Bureau members today that we need to be thinking about or paying attention to?
I would just simply say the last 4 years have been unlike anything I've ever seen. The first few months of this session have surpassed that in bizarreness. All good Farm Bureau members need to pay close attention to what's happening at Oklahoma City and in Washington, D.C., to read the things that I send out, to read the things carefully that the Bureau sends out, to be prepared to respond when we all call for their help to pick up the phone or send an email. We're in uncharted waters. We can get to the other side. Again, I'm an eternal optimist, but it is Speaker Pelosi after all. It is President Biden after all. And it is a very narrowly divided House and Senate. It's going to take some work on all of our parts to make sure the right things happen for the right reasons, for the good of the country, and Oklahoma in particular.
I'll wrap up on a question with your being in the important role you are on science. You and I have had this visit about how well funded National Science Foundation and NIH are compared to ag research. Ag research is, those have gotten increased funding dramatically over the last decade, and ag research has been flat or dropping as a part of the budget. What do we need to do to increase or stimulate more attention to ag research and extension?
We've got to push our members of Congress across the country, our appropriators. You have authorizers like me in the right spots. Bad part about agricultural research is it's been so amazingly successful. It's been so incredibly cost effective that most people enjoy the benefits and don't have a clue where it came from. Then that could be the entire scientific enterprise in the United States. In the $1.5 trillion in the Science Committee, my understanding is there's an allocation of about $750 million. We'll see where Eddie Bernice Johnson, my chairwoman, and the majority want to go with that. But that's a drop in the bucket of $1.9 trillion. We should be spending dramatically more of that on the research enterprise, because we lost a lot of momentum with the lockdowns and the shut-ups of COVID-19, and we've got to restart those enterprises. You see that at OSU, we see that at OUTU, we see that all around the country. We don't want to lose time, because I promise you, our foreign competitors understand how important the scientific enterprise is, agriculture and the broad spectrum, and they're spending liberally to try and not just catch up with us, but get ahead of us, Mr. President. And we can't let that happen.
I'll blindside you with this last question. You mentioned this just hit me while we're talking. We're 50-50 in the Senate. Oklahoma is one of the few states that, Lord forbid, anything were to happen to Senator Inhofe or Senator Langford, our governor does not have the power to appoint a temporary replacement. So the quickest we could have a replacement would be like 9 months or 10 months after something happened. Yes. Is that something with a 50-50 Senate? Is that something our state needs to address?
That change was made when Henry Bellman was inaugurated as governor in 1963, shortly thereafter, because the then Democrat legislature didn't want the first, at that point, only Republican governor being able to appoint people. I just think you'd find it hard to change. And for the benefit of our listeners, in the United States House, governors have never been allowed under the Constitution to make temporary appointments. We always have a special election. And so far, it's served us well in Oklahoma. We just have to move quickly.
Okay, Congressman, we're so grateful for your leadership and to have a real ag guy in Washington, D.C. as part of the Congress and to be able to share your insight from your weekly visits to Sisland on the farm and to run a few cattle. And we're very grateful for your access and input that you give to all of us in Oklahoma Farm Bureau. And anytime we can help or share ideas or inputs with you, you know how to reach us. And we appreciate your continuing to take our calls and whenever Farm Bureau members call you. So thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. President.
We look forward to you all joining us again tomorrow for the wrap-up of this Farm Bureau Leadership Week. And we're so grateful to Congressman Lucas and all the others that have participated this week in our virtual Farm Bureau Leadership Week. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thanks again, Congressman Lucas.